You are watching his laughter travel across a marble hall and land like a stone in the chest of someone you love. You hear the clink of goblets, the scrape of sandals, the low hum of voices that have learned to sound like loyalty. You feel the oil in your hair and the sweat in your palms, the bitter iron of fear rising at the back of your tongue. He stands at the head of the table, towel draped over one shoulder, eyes bright as a child and cold as an accountant. You try to call his name. Your throat tightens. You do not speak. Around you, nobles pretend the room is ordinary, as if spectacle cannot be a verdict. Some smile with practiced delight, some bow their heads and whisper prayers, and a few lean closer, as if to catch a secret. The secret is not performance, it is law. It is a machine that converts ritual into punishment, intimacy into evidence, and laughter into sentence. This is not madness without architecture. This is tyranny by design. In this episode, we will trace the gears of that machine. We will follow how a boy of a famous family was made, how a court bent ceremony into cruelty, and how instruments of state became instruments of humiliation. I will bring together what Suetonius and Tacitus left behind, what fragments of letters and inscriptions allow us to reconstruct, and testimony preserved by men who fled or wrote with their throats still raw. Stay with me, because what you are about to hear is worse than the moment you just imagined, and knowing these mechanisms is how we recognize them when they return to public life. Before we unspool the 5 acts that sustained his power, you need to see how the man was manufactured. A boy named Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus entered a world that smelled of bay leaves, powdered perfumes, and the dust of triumphal arches. He was born into applause and into secrets. His father Germanicus was a hero, his mother Agrippina fierce and watchful, and the household pulsed with both love and ambition. At 7 years old, he watched a procession where veterans spat at a defeated enemy and saw senators avert their eyes. At 9, he learned to hide his temper under jokes, to make charm into a shield. At 12, he observed Tiberius moving like a slow, competent shadow through the palace, winning enemies by ignoring them. There was a moment that hardened him, a private crisis that the sources hint at without stating plainly. A cousin snubbed him at a game, and the boy struck, and the slap was answered by a tutor, who taught silence. He learned that sensation could be regulated, that rage could be slowed and then sharpened into policy. Loss followed in the form of exile, illness, and the sudden deaths that marked the dynasty. He became, by adaptation, both product and project. Where others saw affection, he saw ledger entries. When a play of cruelty summoned applause, he catalogued it as precedent. This is how institutions seed a person with tactics and later harvest those tactics as law. The training of his court was systematic. He watched men like Macro and the prefects convert loyalty into balance sheets. He met courtiers who treated names like accounts and favors like loans. A mentor named Decimus taught him the use of ritual as instrument. A tutor called Publius taught him Latin sharpness. A eunuch whispered that humiliation repeated becomes routine. Caligula learned to weaponize ceremony. He saw how to make a procession into a census of obedience, how to turn gifts into obligations and obligations into entrapments. In the corridors, he observed Cassius Chaerea, a tribune with a face like stone, who joked in private and stiffened in official sight. He watched senators such as Lucius, Marcus, and Flavius maneuver for place, and learned how to set them against one another by offering small public gratifications and vast secret demands. The palace itself became a schoolroom where humiliation was practiced like arithmetic. The learning was clinical, and its instruments were simple: a list, a seating chart, a whispered rumor. Then came the ascent. He came down the steps not as a shadow but as an exhibition. Crowds greeted him with garlands. He knew how to be adored. For a time he performed magnanimity, recalling the memory of his father, offering small reforms and public games that smelled of generosity. But with access came change.
The tone of his public face shifted from cheerful benefactor to proprietor of spectacle. He arranged banquets where a conquered guest was obliged to recite an apology, where a woman was summoned and returned humiliated, where a soldier received praise only to find his family listed among disgraced registries. The first visible transformation was subtle. A law was proposed that required attendance at certain festivals and registered absences as disloyalty. The law was simple, procedural, sterile in language, but behind its clauses there was a calculation. It would give the palace the right to compile lists, to publish names, to make absence itself a bureaucratic offense. It is here that the illusion of fairness hardened into instrument. Act 1 of the machine was registration. A ledger was opened. A clerk named Antonius was tasked with transcribing names, and the simple act of being counted became a test. The ledger looked innocuous under torchlight. Its ink smelled faintly of iron. The feathers of the quills rasped on parchment, and the clerk hummed tunelessly, as if to normalize the act. When a noble missed a ritual, the entry appeared the next day. When the ledger was read aloud at a small ceremony, the room caught like tinder. The effect was immediate and social. Families measured themselves against the list and found fault. The ledger made private absence public and turned reputation into a ledger entry. You can trace this practice to a deliberate conversion of ritual into rule. It used bureaucracy to humiliate, the same way that a ledger might convert a person into a debt. Act 2 amplified humiliation through theater. The court staged humiliations like plays. At a banquet where the air tasted of roast and wine, where the torches rendered every fold of linen into gold, he would single out someone and request a confession. They would be called forward. The room would go quiet. Now, watch this scene. Caligula says, "It is time to know the truth." Senator Lucius stands. His hands tremble. Lucius says, "I have nothing to confess." Caligula smiles and says, "Then tell us what you owe." Lucius replies, "I owe only service." Caligula leans in and says, "Service has many prices." Lucius pleads, "Have mercy." Caligula answers, "Mercy is for friends." Lucius begs, "I am your friend." Caligula says, "Friends can be listed." The exchange is a pulley that pulls reputation taut until it snaps. Each voice contributes to the ritual. You smell roasted pepper. You hear the scrape of chairs. You feel the heat against your skin. You taste the wine sour, and you see beads of sweat on a throat. That scene contains 4 to 6 direct exchanges and becomes a microcosm of the machine at work. Act 3 was bureaucratic cruelty deployed as a spectacle of laws. Announcements were made with a dry cadence. An edict would list infractions and assign public penalties that read like instructions for shame. A messenger named Gnaeus arrived with a scroll every fortnight. His boots left mud on marble. His voice revealed the pattern of reporting, and the announcement turned neighborhoods into counting houses of blame. Testimonies were solicited under oath in courtrooms where the air smelled of ink and dust, and the judges kept their faces impassive. Witnesses included Drusilla, who had once laughed in private and now watched the laughter weaponized against others. Mechanically, the system escalated as files accumulated, as record-keeping hardened into precedent. The ledger fed the proclamations, and the proclamations rationalized more ledger entries. Act 4 targeted intimacy. The most advanced instrument in the machine was emotional blackmail. Fathers were summoned, their hands still smelling of bread from the market. Mothers, once full of tenderness, watched their children listed as offenders in public squares. A private line of questioning, phrased like concern, asked whether a son had been seen at certain gatherings. If the father denied, evidence surfaced that suggested neglect. If he confessed, he lost custody. The method used love as bait and law as trap. In these moments, you smelled sweat and milk and lavender. You saw calloused palms tremble. You felt an ache at the sternum, like a door closing on a family. The instrument was surgical and intimate. A general named Marcus was asked to witness his son being led away because the son failed a ceremonial duty. Marcus could not prevent the boy from being marked. The system used his love against him. The machine, however, met its flaw. The man, who relied on spectacle and humiliation, underestimated the way spectacle breeds conspirators. Cassius Chaerea, who had been mocked privately for his voice and his silence, found numbers behind the ledger. He counted reprisals and named indignities collected over years. Where the machine assumed unanimous fear, Chaerea found resentments that were precise and practical. The assassination was not a riot. It was an instrument of reversal. In the corridor outside a theater, the air smelled of dust and oil. The crowd was noisy with entertainment, and a cry split the music. Chaerea and a handful of officers moved like mechanics unbolting a machine. He struck not out of private fury alone, but because he recognized the systemic violence embedded in ritual and legal forms. When the tyrant fell, he left a body and a machine. The body was mortal. The machine had manuals and habits. The aftermath is a study in survival. The system that had humiliated continued, some of its tools absorbing new operators, others decayed. Senators argued about legacy. Suetonius wrote with relish about grotesque details. Tacitus sought the moral of the story. Some actors claimed reform, promising to return dignity to forbidden places. Others used the crisis as cover to expand their own ledgers. A new prefect named Antonius took the ledger and repurposed it for tax lists, showing how instruments shift use without losing their capacity to dehumanize. The public reacted in mixtures of relief and weary recognition. Families that had been publicly accounted for kept lists in private, trying to vet who might next be named. The question remained, who polices the machine when the body that animated it is gone? At this point, pause and consider. If you are feeling anger or a cold clarity, you are not alone. Which detail unsettles you most? The public ledger? The theaterized confession? The use of love as leverage? The complicity of senators? Or the way institutions simply adapt? Please write in the comments the word ledger, theater, or intimacy so we can gather how this story landed with you. Your response helps map how these mechanisms persist across time and informs future episodes. Thank you for sharing your reaction and for helping build a community that notices patterns rather than only characters. The killing of a tyrant is not always emancipation. After the murder, chaos and bargaining followed. A successor attempted to be milder. Officials who had learned the arithmetic of humiliation kept their ledgers and turned them to new ends. The Senate proclaimed an end to grotesqueries and yet approved pensions for men who had enforced them. There were trials, but the evidence had been drafted by the very clerks who preferred quiet to risk. The legacy of the system is not simply a list of crimes. It is a grammar of governance. It is a way to convert ceremony into punishment, affection into leverage, and record-keeping into leverage. The historian who reads the fragments sees a pattern. Instruments survive better than the hands that wielded them. In the end, there are three compact lessons to carry. First, systems outlast tyrants. The procedures, the habits, and the clerks remain and can be repurposed. Second, cruelty often presents itself as civility. A law reads dryly on paper and cinches the throat in practice. Third, vigilance is not a spectacle. It is attention to the small transformations that make cruelty administrable. If you want to resist, look at ledgers, watch for rituals becoming requirements, and notice when affection is counted. If this investigation was useful, subscribe to follow further episodes where we unpack other historical machines and the little instruments that make large harm possible. Remember the image of the marble hall and the sound of laughter. The deeper question is not why one man laughed, but why a society allowed laughter to be the verdict.